The house stood on a hill. It was old, silent. Daniel felt it watching him as he arrived. He unlocked the front door. Dust lay thick on the floor. He stepped inside. The air was cold. He shivered. This place had a past. He could feel it. The rooms were large and empty. Shadows clung to the corners. He walked slowly, each footstep echoing. Upstairs he found a bedroom. It faced the front. He could see the road from the window. Good. He wouldn't feel so alone. He would start unpacking tomorrow. The next day, Daniel started to unpack. Boxes filled the bedroom. He unwrapped plates, cups, books. He felt good. This was his home now. He was making it his own. In the corner he noticed a door. He hadn't seen it before. It was hidden behind a faded tapestry. He pulled it open. It was a small, dusty room, and in the center on an easel stood a portrait. The portrait was of a family. A man, a woman, and a young girl. They were dressed in fine clothes. Their faces were serious. Daniel stared at the portrait. Who were these people? He had a strange feeling. He couldn't explain it, but he felt drawn to the portrait. He decided to leave it where it was, for now. That night, Daniel lay in bed. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the portrait, the family's faces, their eyes. They seemed to follow him. He got out of bed and walked to the small room. He opened the door and gasped. The portrait had changed. The family's faces were different. The man looked angry, the woman afraid, the girl was crying. Daniel stared. He couldn't believe his eyes. He reached out a hand to touch the portrait, but stopped. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Something wasn't right. He backed out of the room and closed the door. He went back to bed. But he didn't sleep. He lay awake all night, thinking about the portrait and the strange way it had changed. The next morning, Daniel went to the local library. He had to find out more about the house, about the family in the portrait. The librarian was an old man. He knew the house well. He told Daniel that a family had lived there many years ago, the Ashworth family, but they had all died in a fire. Daniel listened intently. He had to know more. The librarian showed him an old newspaper article. It told of the fire. It had been a terrible tragedy. The father, Charles Ashworth, had been a cruel man. He had abused his wife, Amelia, and their daughter, Clara. One night the house had caught fire. No one knew how, but the villagers had whispered. They said that Amelia had started the fire to escape her husband and to save her daughter. Section 5. The Diary. Daniel felt a chill. The story was terrible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He thanked the librarian and left. He went back to the house. He went straight to the small room. He had to see the portrait. The family's faces were different again. The man looked desperate, the woman determined, and the girl resigned. Daniel looked closer. There was something on the floor, at the foot of the easel, a book. He picked it up. It was a diary. He opened the diary and began to read. It was Amelia's diary. She wrote about her life, her husband's cruelty, her fear for herself and her daughter, and she wrote about the portrait. She believed it was cursed, that it held the darkness of her husband's soul. She wrote that she had to destroy it, to free them all. Section 6. Faces of Vengeance. That night, Daniel saw them, the figures from the portrait. They stepped out of the canvas. First Amelia. Her face was etched with sadness. Then Clara, her eyes wide with fear. Finally, Charles, his face contorted with rage. They moved towards him, their hands outstretched. He stumbled back, fear gripping his heart. Their icy breath sent shivers down his spine. He had to escape. He ran from the room. He slammed the door shut. He could hear them on the other side, their voices, angry, menacing. He ran to his bedroom and locked the door. He huddled under the covers, terrified. He knew he had to do something, but what? Section 7. Confrontation. Daniel knew he couldn't run. He had to face the spirits. He went back to the small room. He stood before the portrait. He took a deep breath and spoke. "I know what happened to you," he said. I read the diary. The room grew cold. He could feel their presence. "You don't have to stay trapped here," he continued. Let go of your anger, find peace. The figures flickered, their expressions softening. Amelia stepped forward. She reached out a hand, not to harm him, but to touch his cheek. He felt a chill, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was a feeling of sadness, of regret, of longing. Section 8. Release. Forgive us, whispered Amelia. Her voice was filled with sorrow. We were trapped in our pain, unable to move on. Daniel nodded. I forgive you, he said. Now, please, let go. As he spoke, he felt a warmth spread through the room. The figures began to glow, brighter and brighter, until they were bathed in light. Daniel closed his eyes against the glare. When he opened them again, they were gone. The room was empty, except for the portrait. But it was different now. The family's faces were no longer filled with pain and anger. They were smiling, content, finally at peace. Section 9. The Final Brushstroke. Daniel stood for a moment, letting the silence wash over him. He retrieved Amelia's diary from the floor and carefully placed it on the easel in front of the portrait. He felt a sense of closure, for the Ashworth family, and for himself. He left the room and closed the door. He knew he would never forget them. But now they could rest, and so could he. He went downstairs and made himself a cup of tea. As he sat by the window watching the sunrise, he had a strange feeling. He glanced back at the portrait. Had the girl in the portrait always had his eyes? He shivered. Some mysteries are best left unsolved.